Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests. I apologise if you're all rather crushed. I think we've been moved to this room unexpectedly, and whereas we'd expected to be here until 7 o'clock, I think we're going to be here until 6:30. So those who will be speaking to us, perhaps you will remember there is a time constraint. My name's Lord Maginnis, Ken Maginnis. I'm delighted to see so many people here. It is inspiring to have Iraqi and Iranian people combining to voice together for members of Parliament and for the world in general to hear that they're not satisfied with what's going on in their country and that they want freedom and liberty. By coincidence, it must have been intentional, but I managed to win a raffle today, which allowed me to speak, to ask a question in the House, and I chose to ask a question on the recent execution in Iran, the execution of Ghulam Reza Ghozali, and there were a number of people who joined in to express to our government their discontent with our reaction to the barbarities that are occurring, to the fact that we know two Iranian citizens are being executed every day. We know that the influence of the mullahs on Nouri al-Maliki is such that up to 4,000 people are being killed each month in Iraq. That is very hard to comprehend. But what is even more difficult for people like me to comprehend is why our government, why the Western governments in general, and why the press in particular, are not talking about it. Is it the guilty conscience that the West has over its expedition into Iraq, that we were told was going to produce something worthwhile, and sadly it has only produced a very dubious government, that of al-Maliki, under the influence, totally under the influence of the Iranian mullahs. Well, I was to speak to you later on today, so what I'll choose to do now that I've been elevated by you, I'll say what I'd intended to say. Unfortunately, I have to leave at 6 o'clock. My very good friend, the Lord Clarke, will be taking over when I go. The people of Iran and Iraq have been victimised for more than 11 years. Their blood has been shed in the streets of Baghdad, Basra, Diyala, Fallujah, and in many other cities. They have been killed in mass executions. Their women have been raped and tortured in the dungeons of al-Maliki. Iraq's economy, which should be booming, is in shambles. Despite the fact that Iraq is one of the leading exporters of oil that brings enormous revenues to the country, Iraqi people even in the capital of Baghdad, have to live with long hours where there is no electricity supply and with a situation where there is a shortage of the water supply. Unemployment and poverty is rampant. Corruption in the government and with those affiliated to the government is really quite outrageous. One could almost say it's unbelievable, but it is happening. It is believable, and it's outrageous. Billions of pounds are being embezzled, and the country is being crippled. Maliki has created a mafia-like network of criminals and assassins to eliminate any voice of opposition at all levels. In a certain step-by-step scheme, Maliki is bringing all bodies of power under his dominance. For instance, in Iraq, the president lacks any executive power, but constitutionally, many matters should need his approval. For 2 years now, the President Talabani has been severely ill, and instead of making an arrangement that will work, al-Maliki has ensured that one of the vice presidents who would stand up to him is vilified and is in danger of losing his life, while the other vice president, who is more amenable to him, is being totally ineffective. Now, last year, Mr. Hashami was invited by Struan Stevenson, chairman of the European Parliament's delegation for relations with Iraq, and I was also invited to that meeting. So I was there and heard very sad stories from him about the real situation in Iraq. I was extremely upset, outraged to learn of the mafia network that exists. Last year, Iraqi Parliament approved legislation based on which key posts such as the Presidency, the Speaker of Parliament and the Prime Minister cannot remain in the hands of any person for over 2 consecutive terms. But using his leverage with the judiciary, al-Maliki coerced the Iraqi Supreme Court to issue a verdict declaring the legislation as against the Constitution and had it annulled. So there we have it. We're here today to hear from a very distinguished group of speakers about what is going on and what is leading to the difficulties in Iraq. Can I say that it is in the interests of al-Maliki and his cohorts to project what is happening in Iraq as a conflict between Sunnis and Shias. But those of us who know Iraq somewhat better know that there are many people from either side and from amongst the Kurds who are totally alienated by al-Maliki. We'll be interested, sir, to hear from you today and to learn more about what needs to be done and what our government has to turn its mind to, along with other Western powers. So, without further ado, can I say once again, you all are particularly welcome here today. You come in a noble cause, and I'm grateful to you for doing so. Our next speaker, if I haven't lost my list, my next speaker is Mr. Sabah al-Mukhtar.
My Lords, honourable members of the House of Commons, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. 1991, Iraq occupied Kuwait. The world community decided to liberate Kuwait, and indeed it did liberate Kuwait. In the process, it destroyed a nation called Iraq. 1 million people were killed, which was not necessary to do so. That was followed by 12 years of sanctions, which killed more than 500,000 children, which Mrs. Albright thought that it was a price worth paying to get rid of Saddam Hussein. 2003 invasion of Iraq was ostensibly to create a democracy in Iraq and to have a rule of law in Iraq so that it becomes an example for the Middle East and the rest of the region. It replaced a secular regime by a theocratic one, and a dictatorship at that. They are legislating now for marrying girls at the age of 9 and even younger. The international community, which is busy with a lot of events that are taking place in the region, seems to be oblivious to the current situation in Iraq. The doctrine, the Bush doctrine of accusing anybody who is against him, including the old Europe. No, he didn't accuse the old Europe. Those people who are against him as being terrorists is now being replicated, being used by the regimes in the Middle East, and in particular by Maliki. All those who are opposing the regime, all those people who are demanding their rights, their equal rights, end of sectarianism and the abuse of rights, they are all accused of being terrorists. So he's calling everybody terrorist, and Iraq situation has been reduced to 3 elements: that the Shiites and the Sunnis are killing each other, therefore it's nothing to do with us; that there is an election in Iraq, therefore it's a democratic regime; and that the democratic regime is now fighting Al-Qaeda and terrorism. Well, I would like to tell you that this is really a mutilation of the picture. The tribes of Iraq and many people in many cities have demanded peacefully for a whole year to have services, to have equal rights, to be treated decently. We're only faced with the use of force, which tantamounts, and I tell you as a lawyer, almost to a war crime. We had the Hawija massacre. We had the Fallujah massacre. We had another one in Mosul. Men and women are disappearing, being arrested out of the legal system. They are being raped. The High Commissioner of the Human Rights Council have criticized Iraq repeatedly over the abuses of human rights. Iraq is hanging more people than any other country with the exception of China and Iran. Iraq is the 3rd country on the list of people who are being hanged. Obviously, Maliki continues to say he's hanging terrorists. The media and the world seems to somehow have accepted this by even not putting Iraq on the scene. Anyone who's looking at the media or reading the media, you don't seem to see any reference to Iraq, although there are 1,000 people killed every month. And this is a figure which is probably only matched in the massacre in Syria. But it's certainly more than the number in Yemen, which the BBC keeps covering, or Libya, or Tunis, or indeed even Egypt. This situation pushed us to try and come to this house to plead, to explain that the situation, this is not a natural disaster. This is a man-made disaster. And the United Kingdom took a major part in that one. Britain has lost 179 soldiers who did not die for Queen and country, but for political expediency. I think this issue also needs to be addressed. The Iraqi government, which has an income of in excess of $100 billion a year, that comes to something like 66 billion UK pounds. Yet Iraq still lacks all the infrastructure, even the infrastructure which existed during the sanctions regime, the UN sanctions regime, was functioning better. There is insufficient electricity, water, sanitation, schools, and indeed, even life is no longer secured there. People leave their home and they don't know whether they're coming back or not. Their children, whether they are coming back or not. The political system, which was a creation of the US occupation, ensured through Zalmay Khalid Saad that Maliki becomes the prime minister, because he was one of the few who was accepted by both the USA and Iran. And now they are ensuring that he's going to stay a third term, because there was ostensibly an election. I promise you, the election, when one examines it, it does not meet any of the normal criteria of elections. I would call on this House and that really accountability and an end to impunity for the crimes that committed against the Iraqi people by all should be addressed. There should be a cessation of military support for the Baghdad regime. There should be an openly active condemnation of the abuses of the human rights of the Iraqi people. We call on this House to follow suit the sister parliament, the European Parliament, in this endeavor. The European Parliament has made quite a number of very critical and clear statements on the situation on Iraq. We need to ensure that the judiciary in Iraq, which is now politicized, biased, and not independent, to rid itself of that. And the United Kingdom can play this role by insisting in its relation with Iraq on that issue, to end the corruption by ensuring that the British companies which trade with Iraq should observe the appropriate rules. And then we call on the British government to support the appointment of a special human rights rapporteur for Iraq. Just before I close, my lords, today there was a major event which took place in Iraq. We are likely to see it in the news for the next 2-3 days. What's called the military councils of Iraq, which is made up of the tribes and the people of Iraq, who are guided by some of the military experts, have overrun the government in Mosul. They've taken Mosul, which is the third largest city, the second largest city in the north of Iraq. They are moving now southward toward Sharqat and Tikrit, Salahuddin, and probably moving a little further down. But already Maliki has declared it. This is a Qaeda attack, and he has already called on the neighbors. And we all know who the neighbors are. He called on Iran to come for the assistance to get rid of the Al-Qaeda, and probably he will be calling on the Americans. This is just a taste of what is to come. Thank you very much for your time.
I now have great pleasure in asking Professor Sheikh Abdul Hakim Al-Sadi to address us. You're very welcome, sir.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإن هذه أمتكم أمة واحدة وأنا ربكم فاعبدون.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, this your nation is one nation, and I am your Lord, so worship me.
السلام عليكم وشكرا على الدعوة.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your kind invitation.
يعيش العراق منذ آلاف السنين في شعب واحد متعدد القوميات والأديان قبل دخول الإسلام وبعده. وبعد قيام الدولة العراقية الحديثة فتحنا عيوننا على مجتمع عراقي تتعايش فيه تعايشا سلميا رائعا قوميات وأديان ومذاهب متآخية.
For thousands of years, the people of Iraq lived as one nation of multiple ethnic and religious communities and cultures. This had been the case long before Islam, and so continued thereafter. In the wake of the establishment of modern Iraqi state, we grew up in an Iraqi community where ethnic and religious groups and sects wonderfully coexisted until the disastrous invasion and occupation in 2003.
وحتى العام المشؤوم عام الغزو والاحتلال في 2003 كان المجتمع العراقي متلاحما موحدا لم يشهد أي علاقات توتر بين أبنائه نتيجة هذا التنوع، بل كانوا يعيشون معا وكأنهم قومية واحدة ودين واحد ومذهب واحد.
Iraqi society was united and had never seen any tension between its groups and communities as a result of social diversity. All were living together as if they were one ethnic community, one religious and one sect.
الجار الشيعي بجانب جاره السني وكلاهما إلى جانب جارهما المسيحي والجميع إلى جانب جارهم من القومية الكردية أو التركمانية أو من الطوائف الأخرى.
A Shiite family used to live beside a Sunni neighbor, and both lived along with their Christian neighbor, and everyone coexisted along with their Kurdish and Turkmen families or from other sects.
فالجميع شركاء في الوطن يساهمون في بنائه وتقدمه وينعمون بخيراته ويتساوون في الحقوق والواجبات أمام القانون، حيث لا تمييز في الوظائف العمومية ولا في فرص التعليم ولا في أي ميدان من ميادين العمل والحياة، ماضون إلى هدف واحد في المسير والمصير.
They were all partners in their homeland, contributing to its construction and progress, enjoying its riches and living with equal rights and duties before law. There was no discrimination in employment, in public offices, nor in education opportunities, or in any other field of work and life. All were in one path and oriented towards the same goal.
لقد كنت مسؤولا في جامعة صدام للعلوم الإسلامية ببغداد، وكنا نقبل الطلاب من الشيعة والسنة سواء بسواء على أساس الكفاءة العلمية فقط.
I have experienced this myself when I worked in the administration of Saddam University for Islamic Studies in Baghdad. We used to admit students of both Sunni and Shia denominations on the basis of scientific merits alone.
وكان هناك كيان واحد للشؤون الدينية هو وزارة الأوقاف ترعى الشؤون الدينية لأتباع المذهبين السنة والشيعة والمسيحية تحت خيمة واحدة.
There was one public body for religious affairs, Ministry of Awqaf Endowments, and religious affairs, which looked after all religious affairs related to Muslims, Shia and Sunni, and Christians.
ولم تقسم إلى وقف سني ووقف شيعي كما حصل بعد الاحتلال، وكنت عضواً في المجلس العلمي للوزارة المسؤول عن اختيار المتقدمين للوظائف الدينية، ومعي علماء من السنة ومن الشيعة نعمل معاً.
This has unfortunately changed under the US-UK Occupation Authority, which has split the ministry into two, Shia and Sunni entities. I was a member of the Scientific Council at this ministry responsible for selection of applicants for religious jobs I worked together with other Sunni and Shia scholars.
ولقد كان المؤذن ينادي للصلاة في جميع العراق فيذهب السني إلى مسجده ليؤدي عبادته وفقا لمذهبه والشيعي إلى حسينيته وفقا لمذهبه لا يجد أحدهم غضاضة على الآخر ولا ينعكس ذلك على أي اختلاف أو تناقض.
When the muezzin calls for prayer, and everyone would go to their worship places, as a mosque for Sunnis or Husayniyya for Shia. They all freely practiced their worship, each in accordance with their own teachings, with no animosity or rivalry.
أما قانون الأحوال الشخصية فقد راعت مواده الرأي الأقوى من جميع المذاهب وتضمنت الأحكام الأنسب للمجتمع والأسرة والفرد وأتاح القانون للأفراد حرية اختيار المذهب والتقاضي دون أي حرج أو حساسية.
The personal status marriage law had taken from all Muslim sects the most appropriate provisions for the community, the family, and the individual. The law allowed individuals full freedom to choose their doctrine and litigation without any embarrassment or sensitivity.
ولا يكاد حي أو قرية في العراق يخلوان من حالات التصاهر بين العراقيين من معتنقي المذهبين وثمة عدة قبائل تضم أفرادا ينتمون إلى كلا المذهبين وكل يحمل مبادئ مذهبه ويؤدي عبادته بحرية وأمان.
One can hardly find a neighbor or a village in Iraq without several mixed Shia and Sunni marriages. There are several tribes which include families belonging to both sects. Everyone followed their sect teachings and freely and safely conducted their worship.
وبعد غزو العراق عام 2003 اعتمدت إدارة الاحتلال الأمريكي البريطاني سياسة فرق تسد الاستعمارية ففرضت قوانين وإجراءات جعلت التمييز العنصري والديني والمذهبي والانتهاك المنهجي لحقوق الإنسان أساساً لنظام الحكم الجديد وللحياة السياسية والقوانين الجديدة.
This obviously did not imply any relinquishment of anybody of their beliefs, worship, or principles, and does not reflect negativity on their peaceful coexistence and loyalty for their homeland and nation. Their guiding principle was, as stated in the glorious Quran, you have your own religion and I have mine.
مما ألحق ضرراً جسيماً بوحدة المجتمع العراقي وتعايش أبنائه وفي مقدمة هذه الإجراءات دستور جديد وأنظمة الدوائر العمومية وتعيين موظفيها وأنظمة تشكيل جيش وقوات أمن جديدة وقانون الاجتثاث الفاشي لتجريد ملايين العراقيين الرافضين للاحتلال من حقوقهم المدنية.
A prominent example of such unity was the unified stance taken by Iraqi people against Iran's aggression in the 1980s, particularly by Shia and Sunni members of armed forces. Had it not been for their deep loyalty to their homeland, Iraqi could not have achieved victory which forced humanitarian defeat. After the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the US-UK Occupation Authority applied the notorious colonial divide and rule policy. It imposed laws and procedures which made racial, religious, and sectarian discrimination as well as the systematic violation of human rights the basis of the new regime.
وتبنت إدارة الاحتلال بصورة كاملة أجندة إيران السياسية والاجتماعية والدينية المعادية للعراق فاعتمدت منهجها الديني والاجتماعي القائم على التمييز والتفرقة الدينية والعنصرية ورحبت بدخول أحزاب وميليشيات عراقية مسلحة من إيران أسستها ورعتها المخابرات الإيرانية.
The US-UK Occupation Authority has fully adopted Iran's anti-Iraq political, social, religious agenda and applied its social and religious approach, which is based on religious and racial discrimination. Moreover, the US-UK Occupation Authority welcomed the entry into Iraq from Iran of political or religious parties and militias are armed, financed, and led by Iranian intelligence. From among these parties and militias, US-UK Occupation Authority formed
وشكلت إدارة الاحتلال منها حكومة دمى محلية، وضمت ميليشياتها والتابعة لإيران إلى جيش وقوات أمن جديدة.
From among those parties and militias, US-UK occupation authority formed a puppet government and incorporated Iran-controlled militias into the newly established army and security forces.
وقد وفرت هذه السياسة الحماية الكاملة لحملات دموية قامت بها الأحزاب والميليشيات المرتبطة بإيران للقتل والتهجير والتشريد العرقي والديني والمذهبي، طالت الملايين من أبناء العراق المناهضين للاحتلال وللهيمنة الإيرانية تحت أنظار قوات الاحتلال وبإشراف حكومات الدمى التي نصبتها.
Such policy has provided full protection for bloody campaigns which were carried out by Iranian-sponsored parties and militias, resulting in mass massacres and displacement, as well as ethnic, religious, and sectarian atrocities that afflicted millions of Iraqis who simply rejected occupation of their country and Iran's denominations. These atrocities were committed under the arms of occupation forces and with the blessing and supervision of their puppet Iraqi authority.
وفي نهاية عام 2012 بدأ ملايين العراقيين في 6 محافظات تشكل أكثر من 65% من مساحة وسكان العراق حركة احتجاج شعبية سلمية واسعة على هذه الأوضاع المخلة بحقوقهم الإنسانية والمهددة لحياتهم، واستمرت عاماً كاملاً.
This situation has erected the Iraqi society into a horrible state of terror, ethnic, religious, and sectarian cleansing, and human rights violation, coupled with plummeting government corruption. All are unprecedented in Iraq history. Following the defeat and withdrawal of occupation forces in 2011, as a result of blows delivered by the Iraqi national resistance, US-UK occupation authority handed Iraq over to Iran's followers as represented by Shia political parties and their terrorist militias. This has further escalated repression and human rights violations to a very serious level that is officially sponsored by the government.
إنني أصالة عن نفسي ونيابة عن شقيقي فضيلة العلامة الشيخ الدكتور عبد الملك السعدي كبير علماء العراق ومن ورائنا علماء العراق كلهم، أعلن لكم أن أمريكا وبريطانيا وإيران ومن اشترك معهم في غزو العراق واحتلاله يتحملون المسؤولية السياسية والقانونية والجنائية والأخلاقية عن هذه الجريمة البشعة.
Prisons were filled with hundreds of thousands of Iraqi men, women, and children who have been subjected to horrible atrocities of murder, rape, and various forms of brutal torture and summary trials that are lacking in the basic norms and standards of international justice. Towards the end of 2012, a peaceful popular protest movement started by millions of Iraqis demanding the renunciation of those measures and laws which violated their essential human rights and threatened their basic living conditions. The peaceful protest, which took place in 6 provisions representing more than 65% of the area and the population of Iraq, lasted for a whole year. The Iranian-sponsored Maliki government not only rejected the demands of those millions of peaceful protesters, but also attacked the protest killing in cold blood, hundreds of them. It also launched military operations against protesting provinces, which forced their tribes to stand in defense of themselves, their towns, and their lives.
Thank you. Can I ask His Excellency Mr. Denis Halliday, former Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations, to address us? Thank you.
It's good to be here, to listen to and talk about Iraq 2014. What a tragic situation we have for all Iraqis, for the region, and for all of us, including the UN Security Council that has repeatedly failed the people of Iraq in all aspects since 1990. Over the past 30 years, Iraq as a modern state has been largely destroyed. Destroyed by those wishing to control oil and oil prices, and those who wish to have strategic military presence in the Middle East. Sadly, the UN Security Council, undemocratic, controlled by 5 veto powers and led by Britain and the United States, has directed the various means of this destruction. Self-serving support for the Iran-Iraq war with the hope of mutual destruction, seduction into the invasion of Kuwait as a device to set up Baghdad for the first Gulf War of 1991, plus sanctions from 1990 to 2003, a catastrophic period. UN sanctions, a form of warfare, as per Article 41 of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, with terminal consequences for the children and innocent people of Iraq. As my friend Sabah just said, who can forget the cold declaration of Madame Albright, then Secretary of State, that somehow killing 500,000 Iraqi children could be justified. In fact, UN sanctions not only killed 2 or 3 times more than that number of Iraqis, but it softened Iraq for the US-UK invasion of 2003. And that was by design, a continuum of warfare on the people of Iraq. Participating in a UN human rights workshop on 23 May in Geneva recently, I was not surprised to note that Iraqi sanctions, or sanctions on Iraq, remain a focus for study and condemnation as multilateral coercive measures, deemed genocidal by many. We await not only the publication of the Chilcot report, but we await determination of the ICJ that UN sanctions were intentionally murderous and destructive to the Iraqi people and therefore constitute genocide. Have we found accountability for the consequences of sanctions and the invasion of 2003? No, we have not. Despite the state of state terrorism, of shock and awe, and the horrors of invasion, bombing, and prolonged occupation, no prosecution of Prime Minister Blair or President Bush has resulted. This is conspicuous Western United Nations double standards, I repeat, double standards, on the part of the ICC, which prosecutes petty African dictators, but lacks the will or authority to deal with people like Prime Minister Blair or President Bush, and their violent collaborators in London and in Washington in regard to war crimes, atrocities, and torture in Iraq. Misused Security Council power has corrupted the United Nations in respect of peace and security. And let's not pretend we are surprised, knowing as we do that some 85% of military arms and weapons are manufactured and sold by the same 5 veto powers that we entrust with peace and security. Last week, Washington confirmed the sale, I believe, of 36 F-16s to Baghdad. I suspect Britain is not far behind in similar arms races, arms deals. The Council must be reformed, be democratic and properly representative of the 7+ billions of people around the world today for whom peace and security is a requirement for their very survival. When I look at today's Iraq, I do not recognize it. Infrastructurally destroyed by US bombing of civilian infrastructure such as electric power, water and sewage treatment systems in 1991, little, if anything, has improved. Since then, and as Dr. Abdul Hakim al-Sadi has stated, under military occupation, the US took actions in violation of international law applying to situations of military occupation, changing the constitution, abolishing the armed forces that kept the Iraqi border safe, abolishing the Ba'ath Party, which created millions of unemployed, civil servants and others, administration, education, healthcare, collapsed. The current regime has used the US-UK divide and rule tactic of separating Iraqis on the basis of ethnicity or religious faith, leading to what is surely civil war. I believe the brutality of the regime today is directly linked to the continuous and deadly sanctions, invasion, and occupation that Iraq has experienced for the entire lives of possibly the majority of its population, a huge number, of course, who are young people and no different. Discrimination, human dignity, of an ancient culture, has been stripped from Iraq. Discrimination, abuse, rape, kidnapping, as I think we've heard already, destruction of homes and mosques, corruption is hard at work. Funds are being shipped out of the country, which belong to the people, may be entering London, and I would request the government of Great Britain to try to stop that inflow of illegal monies. Justice has been driven out, and years of religious tolerance has been lost, as mentioned by Dr. Hakim. Human suffering is intolerable. This is unacceptable for reasons of human rights, good governance, domestic and international law. In addition, the loud silence of the United Nations, the United States, the UK, and the EU is both unacceptable and intolerable. We, in quotes, interfered in Iran and Iraq war. We interfered in 1990, 1991 with sanctions, the invasion and military occupation. Surely the UK and the UN must now interfere again. This time, however, not with coercion or military invasion or threats of force, but with cooperation, support, assistance for democracy and change. Surely the UK, with its long history vis-à-vis Iraq, has some authority to change the means employed by the present regime to restore Iraq and the Iraqi people to human well-being. Iraq needs the very best the UK, the UN can offer. Reparations, just as Iraq has paid some $50 billion in reparations to Kuwait. Compensation to families who've lost their homes, their lives disrupted by being IDPs or being refugees. Respect for Iraq and Iraqi people who want to have positive change and need assistance to that end. A coming together of the 5 veto powers to support and assist. France, Russia, and China already have influence in Iraq, but together the Security Council could accomplish, with good governance, a massive rebuilding of infrastructure, opportunities, employment, education, re-establishing self-respect, the very lives taken and destroyed by the UN Security Council failures since 1990. We need Britain to play a major role, as she has in the past, in the Council to make that Council work, this time for the people of Iraq, not against them. A young friend of mine, a young Iraqi friend of mine, graduated the other day from Oklahoma University. I went down to see him and congratulate him, and he told me that UN troops, or former UN troops in Iraq, who served in Iraq, still think they served to liberate, which puts him in a very awkward spot, you can understand. But here in London, in this very building, we all know better. Great Britain is big enough to recognize accountability and demand of the Security Council, of the Americans, of the EU action to support and assist Iraqis as they put their extraordinary country back together again. Thank you.
Now, have you got the film ready to roll? Yes. Well, if you'd like to, we'll do the film, and then we'll be addressed by His Excellency Dr. Isam al-Chalabi, and former Iraq oil minister.
إذا رحنا يا أمي موتنا 2013 has been one of the deadliest, most violent years in Iraq's history. But unlike before, the carnage is not a result of war, nor a consequence of terrorist attacks. Iraqis are now suffering at the hands of the very people who should be serving them, their own government. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Nouri Maliki, large parts of the country have been subjected to systematic discrimination, indiscriminate attacks, and state-sponsored terrorism. These include entire cities such as Mosul, Anbar, and Diyala. In the last year alone, government security forces conducted more than 1,500 raids, mostly on homes of innocent citizens. Over 14,000 civilians have been arbitrarily arrested and detained. Almost 8,000 have been killed. And these are the figures released by the government itself. The actual number of those who have suffered at the hands of this oppressive government believed to be much higher. Meanwhile, those fortunate enough not to have been killed or injured by the government's war on its own people suffered on a daily basis. They struggled to cope in areas with little or no public service. The government refused to invest in infrastructure despite the country's budget of over $100 billion. Many in Iraq are made into second-class citizens in their own country. In 2010, the residents of Basra took to the streets in what became known as the electricity protests, a desperate attempt by the people to have their message heard by a government which continued to ignore them. Then, November of the following year, residents of 16 of Iraq's governorates rose up to demand reform and their rights to live in a democratic and free society. The government's response, under the direct orders of the Prime Minister, was a brutal crackdown that resulted in deaths, injuries, and countless arrests. But despite the killings and this renewed wave of oppression, the people of Iraq did not give in. They continued to hold tightly to their rightful demands to live freely, to their dream that after years of war, a new free Iraq would emerge. In December 2013, Iraqis across 6 different governorates rose up once again in mass protests, peaceful in nature, disciplined and organized, with clear demands. Among them, the cessation of mass arbitrary arrests and detentions, cancelling Article 4 of the terrorism law, which is being used to quash any legitimate opposition, specifically from Iraq's Sunni population. But again, rather than listening to the people's demand, the government opted to continue its oppression, using the only method it seems to know: violence. Under the direct orders of Prime Minister Nouri Maliki, the army, the police, and even special forces SWAT teams were used to attack the peaceful sit-ins in Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, and other cities, killing hundreds of innocent and unarmed protesters in broad daylight. Despite this, the sit-ins remained peaceful, adamant that they will continue their unarmed struggle for freedom. In fact, the protest leaders publicly invited the authorities to send in observers to inspect these sit-ins and see for themselves that all those gathered were unarmed and peaceful in nature. Maliki, however, was insistent that these sit-ins has to be dispersed before the 2014 parliamentary elections by any means necessary. Maliki himself threatened the protesters: "End your protests before we end you." Weeks later, Maliki stayed true to his words, once again sending in the army to kill the very people it should be protecting, to bomb the very country it's tasked to guard. Even the Air Force was used, indiscriminately firing down on defenseless civilians whose only crime was to take to the streets, protesting and demanding a better life. What confounded the situation and made it even more deadly was the government's attack on the Sunni tribes in Fallujah, Anbar, and the north of Iraq. It seemed as if Maliki was intent on wreaking as much havoc as possible in Iraq, in sowing the seeds of division and sectarianism even more. As a result of this unabated campaign against peaceful dissent and the unprovoked attacks on the tribes of the north, Iraq is burning, arguably more than ever before. The recent sham elections, which were skewed from the outset in favor of Maliki and his allies, make the issue even more problematic, invalidating the only glimmer of democracy that might have existed. Amid these facts, the Iraqis' only hope remained to exist in dignity and equality.
My Lords, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen, our case started 100 years ago with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and what followed with the treaties of Sykes-Picot, San Remo, and the others that distributed the land in accordance with the existence of the oil wealth in those regions. At that time, it was led by Britain and France. 100 years later, it all started again. During the 90s of the last century, with the introduction of the 13 years long sanctions, they started preparing for studies, including mainly how to handle the oil wealth in Iraq, known to have at least second largest reserves in the world. But this time it was led by the Americans, supported by the British. And all the studies showed that one of the main reasons, if not the reason, was oil. And this is why demonstrators in this country and many other countries were saying it was a war for oil. Well, after the war, 2003, the Americans started pushing for what they called a constitution, because they thought this was to ensure how they would divide the country into three major components: Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds. They introduced that constitution in 2005, and then afterward they concentrated all their efforts on preparing for an oil and gas law. You would wonder why. I explained that to you. You see, in the existing laws that were introduced way back in the 60s, 1967 in particular, Law 97 of year 1967, it specifies that any cooperation between the Ministry of Oil and a foreign entity to develop any oil field in Iraq can only be done throughout a legislation by the Parliament. Well, they didn't want that. They wanted something else. So they wanted an oil and gas law. And although it had many loopholes, but they did not manage to pass it through the Parliament. So they went ahead, signing contracts after contracts, all by themselves. It's a one-man show. In Baghdad, they awarded the development of almost 80% of the reserves of Iraq to a number of companies, around 15 of them, mainly IOCs, the national oil companies, led by companies like BP, British Petroleum, ExxonMobil, ENI, Total, and the rest of them. And they were all managed completely by one man and supported by the Maliki government, or Maliki himself. He wouldn't go to the Parliament, even though the Parliament was supporting him. So all these contracts that were signed were not legislated by laws. And in accordance with the existing laws, since they did not manage to pass a new law so the existing laws remain valid. And any legal man will tell you that. What happened then? It was the Kurdish region who went ahead and they distributed the land into over 50 blocks. And they signed contracts, almost 50 of them. So now we have almost the whole of Iraq as divided among companies, whether by Baghdad or by the north. And now production is being handled jointly, supposedly, by the companies and the Iraqi Ministry of Oil, but of course, the companies have a veto right. So in fact, the authority of the Iraqis has disappeared. And they are charging Iraqis, and they are costing Iraq a lot of money, because the cost of production in Iraq that used to be less than $1 a barrel is costing them now at least $20 a barrel. And then where all this money goes? Production hasn't increased that much. Export hasn't increased that much, but the prices has increased. Prices has increased from about $10, $15 a barrel to over $100 a barrel. So what happened? The revenue jumped from $10, $15 billion a year to over $100 billion. And make note of this. During the period from 1927, when when oil was discovered by BP, until 2003, the total revenue that had been gathered was around $280 billion. Over 70 years, $280 billion. How much did we gather from 2003 until now? Over $700 billion. What do they have to show for this $700 billion? Where is it? Where did it go? Do we have new hospitals? Do we have new roads? Do we have new hospitals? Do we have new refineries? Oh no, sir, we don't have refineries. We have to import oil. Can you imagine? With all this production, we import oil products, while the past regime, under sanctions, was able to export over 200,000 barrels a day. Gas. Iraq is the #1 country in the world, not only the most corrupt, and not it is the most dirtiest, plus, but it is the #1 country in the world that is flaring gas. And what do? We import gas from our neighbor, Iran. Iran is building a pipeline to Baghdad to generate power from 2 power stations. And they are also building a pipeline to Basra and they're providing Basra with gas. Why did the trouble start in Basra? Because electricity was cut off because Iran stopped supplying gas. So Iraq is now under the mercy of Iran in many ways, including this item, the power generation. The Kurdish region, against all logic, against all the legal issues, against the constitution that they have written, they started their own production and now export, and unfortunately supported by Turkey, allowing the Kurdish region to export. So now we have 2 Iraqis exporting oil, 2 Iraqis competing how to sell oil abroad. And next day they will compete with the prices also. And a week ago, the governor of Basra said, why only the Kurdish region is doing that? I want to do the same. I want to do the same. And here I rest my case before you go. Thank you very much, my Lord.
Those of you that know me and my association with the resistance of Iran know that I've been saying for many, many years the problem that we face is the oil beneath the ground in Iran. And now we've heard very clearly the problem that Iraq faces because of their oil. And it's a tragedy that our world can't live in peace. Now, I was supposed to make a speech, but there isn't time.
I very strongly believe that today's tragic Iraq reality can only be understood if the additive impact of years before and the years following the US-UK government's illegal invasion and occupation is fully taken into account. This context, in my opinion, involves three very distinct time periods. 1990 to 2003 saw 13 years of the most comprehensive economic and financial sanctions ever levied on a country by the UN Security Council. Initially, the UN Security Council did not provide any social safety net whatsoever to the people of Iraq. The Iraqi people were at the mercy of external donations, and these turned out to be well below the minimum estimated by the UN Secretary General to sustain life. A UN humanitarian exemption, the Oil for Food program, began only in December of 1996. It provided important but severely inadequate subsistence support amounting to a paltry 51 cents worth of supplies per person per day. Not commonly known is that this so-called UN humanitarian program, authorized by the UN Security Council, was entirely financed from Iraq's own resources, its oil revenue. The word humanitarian is therefore a very painful misnomer. One compelling statistic of misery resulting from this reality is the following. During the years of UN sanctions, Iraq's child mortality rates were as high as 132 of 1,000 children dying before reaching the age of 5. Together with Afghanistan, these rates were among the highest in the world, according to UNICEF. A sobering conclusion about the irresponsibility of the UN Security Council was presented in 2000 to the Council by the Ambassador of Malaysia to the United Nations, Dato Agam Hasmi, and each time I present this, I have goose pimples, I must tell you, who stated in the United Nations Security Council, how ironic is it that the same policy that is supposed to disarm Iraq from its weapons of mass destruction has itself become a weapon of mass destruction. 2003 to 2011 witnessed horrific violations of the Hague and Geneva Conventions by the occupying powers, symbolized by, who can forget, the Iraqi man with a hood in the Abu Ghraib jail near Baghdad. People's courts, tribunals concerning Iraq, held in many parts of the world since, have credibly established the culpability of Western leaders, especially former US President Bush and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. The most detailed evidence yet has been compiled, my Lord, by the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission, of which Mr. Denis Halliday and I are members. We would like to present to you today and this meeting 2 volumes of torture and war crimes related evidence compiled by the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission. Since the departure of US and foreign forces from Iraq in 2011, and since social and political chaos have further intensified in the country. We have heard this. I don't want to go into details that have been said before, but I do want to say that the resulting national human balance sheet in 2014 is sobering. Out of an estimated population of 33 million, 23% live in poverty in this immensely oil-rich country. 600,000 children have become street children, something which is unknown or was unknown before 1990. Transparency International refers to Iraq's rampant corruption as the 178th out of 181 countries. A staggering 14% of Iraqis are orphans. Hashish and heroin, not a problem when I was in Baghdad, not a problem before 2003, are an increasing concern. In 2007, the World Bank estimated that almost 23% of Iraqis were illiterate, and 5 million school-aged children that should be in school were not in school. Serious health problems have arisen, much too little discussed in the international debate on Iraq because of occupation forces' use of depleted uranium and white phosphorus. One must ask, how much can a people take? My second observation, briefly, justice, peace, and accelerated nation rebuilding must be the priority of the moment. There was no UN Security Council commitment in this respect when my colleague and close friend, Mr. Halliday, and I served in succession in Iraq. For this reason, we resigned. It is therefore crucial to realize that the Iraq tragedy has also wider implications for the way in which the community of nations lives together. The perpetrators of 24 years of continuous mistreatment of a people are known. Large amounts of evidence in this regard has been collected. Sir John Chilcot's demand to have key evidence of possible war crimes by occupation forces published should be respected, but the same applies to other evidence involving years of sanctions and years of occupation in Iraq. The United Nations and member countries should no longer be allowed to make excuses to avoid releasing such evidence to the public. I'm almost at the end, but let me say here, to arraign perpetrators involved during any of these 3 time periods identified above, and the preparation of court cases must not be considered utopian. I agree with Dr. Al-Mukhtar, ending impunity remains a serious demand from civil society. Qualified individuals are available, quite a few, to prepare specific court cases and timelines, as well as to mount campaigns to obtain civil society funding. The ICC's reluctance, the International Criminal Court's reluctance to accept the mandate and responsibility for hearing Iraq cases against former senior US and UK officials is unacceptable. The submission by the public interest lawyers in the UK of cases of military abuse in southern Iraq constitutes a significant step in challenging the ICC to accept the Iraq file. I want to end by saying continued support from both houses of the UK Parliament will give much credibility a justice for Iraq process requires, and the respect, I deeply mean that, respect Iraqi society deserves. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Saad Naji Jawad, who is Professor in Political Science, a visiting professor at the LSE, and the floor is now yours, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. My Lord, respected guests, I will be very brief. As students of political science, we were told that decision-making in the West and in the United States are taken according to the pressure of public opinion, pressure and feeling of public opinion. Yet, in 2003, the feelings and demonstrations of millions of people in the United States and Britain were simply thrown in the dustbin, and politicians took the decision to invade, destroy, occupy and destroy Iraq without any respect to the public opinion. Also, before the initiation of this war, of this condemned act of aggression, the British and US media were filled with distorted evidence about Iraq's position of WMD. The false claims and imaginary testaments of some Iraqis whose only objective was to get a residency in the country they resorted to were engrossed and made as facts by by many bad-intentioned politicians, journalists, and media men. When the dust of war was cleared out and all the evidence came to the surface proving that Iraq had no WMD and no program to develop them, nobody apologized for misleading the world public opinion. The very renowned British justice stood short of bringing all those who had misled the British people to account. I should also add here the behavior of British representatives in the Sanction Committee in the United Nations between 1999 and 2003, who took sarcastic decisions to block the flow of food and medical materials to Iraq. Isn't it time to question these representatives about their hubris and underrating of the life of many Iraqis? Isn't it time to bring all those who took this decision or those who supported them, starting from Mr. Tony Blair down to the smallest journalist who wrote articles filled with mendacity, to justice? Or the Iraqis have to wait for another 80 years, like the Armenian people, to hear a certain British Prime Minister apologizing to them? Isn't it time for British justice and politicians to take a step to pay back the Iraqi people? So, another note I want to make about the Constitution. Suffice to say that the Constitution did not look at Iraq and Iraqis as one nation and one people, but a collection of Kurds, Arab and other minorities, Sunnis and Shiites. It also gave the provinces more powers than the central government. It also intensified the sectarian and racial division in Iraq. Needless to say that the United States outlined and speeded the approval of this document in order to justify its exit strategy, which it chose following the success of the Iraqi resistance in foiling a strategy of fully dominating Iraq. It wanted to turn its failure into an imaginary success by telling the world it established a democracy in Iraq and left. I believe the human rights issue is another matter which I should concentrate on, but I will not be talking about it because I think the British know what has happened in Basra and Abu Ghraib, and yet culpable people escape punishment yet until now. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Mr. Subhi Toma, expert on minorities and immigrants.
سوف أتكلم بالعربية. أحاول أن أختصر.
I will try to speak as briefly as possible.
لكي أثبت أنني شاركت كممثل للأقلية المسيحية في العراق.
Christian minority in Iraq.
اسمي توما.
My name is Toma.
وهو مشتق من اسم القديس توما الذي نشر المسيحية في بلاد الرافدين.
Which is derived from Saint Toma, who promoted Christianity in the Mesopotamia.
أنا أعمل وأقيم في فرنسا منذ 44 عاما.
I live and work in France for 44 years.
اختصاصي هو علم الاجتماع، وقد اهتميت بأحوال اللاجئين والمهاجرين طيلة هذه الأعوام.
My specialty is sociology, and I am concerned with migrants and refugee situation throughout this period.
وشهادتي هنا هي إن ما سمعته ورأيته عن المهاجرين واللاجئين العراقيين.
My evidence here is derived from the statements and my observations about the Iraqi refugees.
يفوق كل الروايات التي شاهدتها خلال فترات عملي.
It outweighs all the narratives and the observations I had throughout my life.
رئيس الطائفة الكاثوليكية العراقية الأسقف ساكو.
The head of the Catholic sect, Saint Sako,
صرح مؤخرا يقول بأن المسيحيين في العراق هم في طريق الانقراض.
Recently said that Christians in Iraq are on their way of extinction.
وهذا يشمل أيضا الأقليات الأخرى مثل الصابئة واليزيدية والشبك.
Other minorities like Sabians, Yazidi and Shabak.
وكل هذا بسبب الفوضى التي فرضتها القوى الكبرى في بلدي.
All of that is because of the chaos which was imposed by the superpowers in my country.
وأحد علماء الاجتماع يقول أن سبب الفوضى في العراق هو حينما جاء الحلفاء وقالوا إن العراق مكون من شعوب وأقليات.
One of sociology scholars attributed the chaos to the statements by the alliance forces when they came to Iraq, that Iraq is composed of sects and minorities.
فشجعوا الشعب الكردي الغني بالنفط.
That encouraged the Kurdish people whose region is rich in oil.
والشعب الشيعي الغني بالنفط.
And the Shiite people whose region is rich in oil too.
وأهملوا الشعب السني لأنه لا يملك النفط.
And they ignored the Sunni part, which do not
واحتقروا
own
الأقليات لأنه لا قيمة لها.
And disrespect minorities who are valueless in their view.
إذا كانت القوى الكبرى أو الدول الحلفاء تعتقد أن الانتخابات الميكانيكية هي الحل لإعادة البناء العراق فهي على خطأ.
If the superpowers think the mechanical elections are the device to restore Iraq, that is wrong.
لأن تمزيق العراق إلى شعوب وأقليات جعله يفتقد إلى الإرادة الوطنية الواحدة.
Because shredding Iraq into minorities realized in loss of national and unified will.
والانتخابات الميكانيكية تعمل على تمزيق النسيج الاجتماعي العراقي أكثر ما تخدمه.
The mechanical elections shred the Iraqi texture rather than serving it.
دول التحالف التي جاءت بالحكومة الحالية إلى السلطة يمكنها أن تطلب من حكام العراق أن يحترموا الحقوق المواطنين بشكل عادل، وحين ذاك يمكن خلق إرادة وطنية عراقية موحدة لإعادة بناء العراق. وشكرا.
The alliance powers which brought the current regime can ask the current regime to respect the rights of citizens and to realize justice for people.